Okay, welcome to Plant Science 1. My name's Derek Schultz. I'm going to be doing these online lessons with you guys. That's what the college has decided to do for this particular course. Thank goodness not for all of yours. Having said that, I'll say there are some pluses to having a video lesson in that you can go back and repeat something that I said if it didn't make sense. Um, so let's work with it. Going to do my best, and I've got a different tablet this term, so we'll see how it goes. Bear with me as I'm kind of learning. This is actually my third time through this, so whew. Anyways, Plant Science 1, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be learning about, like it says here, how and why plants are structured the way they are. So you're going to be looking at microscope slides of different types of plant tissues and talking about why they are the way they are. We're going to discuss about how water moves through a plant and how gases move through a plant. These are such important elements to understanding plant growth, um, particularly in a greenhouse context where we really can influence the movement of gases and water in crops to try to improve quality or whatever. We're also going to look at how plants grow and mature, looking at flowers and different structures, um, teach you some of the jargon around that, which can be helpful. Look at plant reproduction, give you some introductions to that. Some of it, I'm sure some of you have been exposed to before, but there's some fascinating little caveats in how plants go about that in different species. So we'll look into some of that. And then we're even going to do a little bit of tissue culture and some interesting little physiological experiments. So I hope you're looking forward to this course. I know it can be a lot of fun. Uh, from my perspective, it starts off a bit dry because we have to do plant taxonomy or how to name and identify plants for the first two lessons, no less. Um, and I'm going to just be totally upfront here with you and tell you that plant taxonomy is not my forte. I'm a greenhouse guy. When you grow only 5 species of plants for many years, why would you need to know 300 different names? But anyways, that's okay. Not all of you are greenhouse. Quite a few are hort. Some are landscape. And in hort and landscape, knowing all these different genus species stuff is really important. So we're gonna go through the history of that and how it works, and just explore it. A little bit about the instructors. Linda McDonald and Paul Zammit are going to be running the labs. So they're typically we'll do like a review of the lesson. Some of you might choose just to go to the lab and listen to their lesson. I don't know. It's up to you. I hope that you listen to my lessons. But I mean, hey, I get paid anyways. But no, seriously, um, I hope that you find some value in both. Um, and they, all three of us have been around this course for quite a while. It's been a few years since I've taught. I've been put back in briefly, so I'm kind of excited about it actually. But I don't get to do the labs, which kind of sucks, but that's okay. A bit of my background, it's on the slide. It's not a brag slide, but sometimes students want to know who you are and where you come from so that they are convinced that maybe you know something. I mean, let's be honest. I suppose if they just chuck someone in front of you in the class, you have no idea if they know what they're talking about. Typically, I try to be honest about what I know and what I don't know. And as I said, taxonomy is something that I don't know a lot about, but I know a lot about other stuff. But so if you have any taxonomy questions, go after Paul and Linda. Um, anyways, did school, did some research, had a lot of fun, tried industry, bought my own farm, loved that for quite a few years, enjoyed it quite a bit, started teaching, and some investor dude wanted to buy my farm, and my kids didn't want to run it, so we sold it, and I miss it horribly. But anyways, I'm here, and I'm enjoying teaching too, which is good. Don't enjoy the college stuff, but I do love teaching. So I think ultimately that's best for you guys, right? Um, so what do you expect in this course? Okay, so we got weekly lessons. I'll post the PowerPoints so you have access to those, and I'll post the YouTube video um, is as well each week. So this week's posted. You won't see next week until we're on top of it. That's partly because I'm going through the lessons to make them fresh and make my versions so that as I go through them, you see them. There are a few assignments throughout the course of the term. Paul and Linda are going to introduce those in the labs. There's no point in me rattling on about them today. There's a kind of a take-home one. There's some other little things, and we have quizzes periodically as well, just to keep you on top of your game. And then obviously there's a midterm and a final. Um, Important documents, teaching and learning plan. That's under course information on Blackboard. I don't recommend you download that document and print it off and put it in the front of your binder because it can change. So best is to just click back to the document and look at it and see what's new or changed or anything. And typically, if there's a change, we would announce it. We wouldn't just change it. So we try to communicate as best as we can. And typically, any questions, just ask one of us. Linda, Paul, myself, all happy to answer your questions. Email's the best. Your textbook is under course documents in a PDF form, which is fantastic. Saves paper. It was actually written by a professor that retired or a teacher or instructor or whatever. Then it retired a few years ago, named Olga Piedrahita, and she is a phenomenal woman, knows a lot about plants, and she wrote a really good book. I'd recommend you read it and follow along the course as we kind of try to follow the roadmap of the textbook a little bit. So getting right into it. So I just want to introduce plant classification. We're going to get into some more nitty gritties next week. But um, out of interest, the term horticulture is a compound word from Latin of hortus and cultura. So hortus was for garden and cultura was cultivation. So I'm not sure why that picture's there other than to show some like plants being cultivated, I guess. So interesting, Carl Linnaeus is has sort of been traditionally regarded as the father of what we call binomial classification, right? The classic how we name species. Um, in more recent years, historians have been a bit more accurate. It's in fact the Swiss botanist Gaspard Bauen, who actually almost a century before invented the term genus for the two binomial named species of genus and species. And genus is a word for stock, which means like coming from this group or stock of. Um, and Carl Linnaeus typically he rolled in Gaspard's names, of which he named thousands of species. He rolled them into his system when he got going. Now, Carl Linnaeus is a controversial character in this day and age of woke stuff, where we're kind of reviewing our history and trying to understand who these people were. Carl Linnaeus is maybe not the most heroic individual we had thought, because he's actually regarded by modern day historians as the father of racism because he classified humans in an unequal fashion. In a sense, legitimizing racist ideas in early science culture, which, has had huge impacts on people. Um, in the times of Carl, basically wealthy people got on boats and they traveled around the world and they sampled species and brought them home and had fun collecting and naming them. And at the same time, we started slave trading, and by classifying humans as different orders, they would sort of legitimize their base treatment of people, which is horrendous and really not acceptable by modern standards. So, um, anyways, Carl, as I say here, is because you know me, I don't like taxonomy, but anyways, he's a pain in the butt because we have all these names. Why do we have to learn them all? Oh my goodness. Anyways, obviously there's a reason. I've written some examples here: white pine, red pine. So Pinus strobus for white pine and Pinus resinosa for red pine. Uh, Truthfully, neither really helps in my mind. I don't understand all these things. The red pine, sometimes people think it's called red pine because as the bark peels away, it reveals a bit of a red tinge. But from those two, from Derek's amateur opinion, a white pine has bunches of 5 needles, and red pines have bunches of 2 needles. So Derek, the DS version of the genus species would be Pinus duo or Pinus quince for white pine. Obviously, I'm just being silly. Anyways, no one's going to care what Derek names a pine tree. Um, but obviously the entire world doesn't speak English, so Latin seemed at the time, and probably in the scientific world still today, is generally accepted as the international language for what we call nomenclature or classification. Um, the world is increasingly becoming English, which is, convenient for me because I speak English, but it's a bonkers language. But anyways, so still around. And typically the way this works is we have a hierarchy. So it's like you start with the large filing cabinet of a kingdom, and then within that there's another filing cabinet of division, and then inside division there's class, and so these are nested inside each other like a Russian doll. You start at the kingdom and you drill all the way down to genus and species. And it's primarily the bottom two that we're interested in, genus and species, right? So we're human, and so we are Homo sapien. Uh, and I've got a few examples. So looking at apples specifically, we can see, okay, so it's a plant. It's in Magnoliopta, which means it's a flowering plant. It's Magnoliopsida, which means it's a dicot. We're going to go into some of these things as we go through. And it's in the rose family, as I mentioned, and of course, it's an apple. If we look at white pine, for example, it's also a plant, but it's in a totally different division. It's in the gymnosperms. And so it's in the conifer family, which is in the pine order. So it's totally unrelated to an apple tree, other than the fact that they're both in the plant kingdom. And then looking at a coconut, it's also in the plant kingdom. It's a flowering plant, but it's a monocot. And so it's further divided from both the pine tree and the apple tree. And then, of course, it's in its own palm order. So then there's all the related palms. So in modern day scientists, on this day and age, a lot of the sort of genus species classifications are actually being revised. Historically, the way this worked was these rich, privileged people would travel around the world collecting specimens, and in the case of plants, they would press them and dry them, and they would make notes and sketches and drawings about the flowers and the leaf structure and the growing habit. And with all the details they could muster, they would make associations and divisions between different types of plants. And to be fair, a lot of their classifications have held true to this day, which is pretty remarkable, considering, sometimes all they had were dried pressed flowers to look at. But in modern day science, though, we have the tools of molecular biology, so we can sequence the DNA. And just like you could go online and look at your family's genetic history, plants can be analyzed using genetics, and we can basically definitively prove if a species is in fact related or not. And with that new technology, we've been starting to make quite a few revisions to genus and species names that were named by Carl Linnaeus. By the way, you'll often see a CL beside the genus species if it's still using the name that Carl had assigned, or the predecessors that he scammed. Anyways, so typically scientists that love this kind of stuff will meet every year for a convention, and they'll spend hours debating a single genus and species and have passionate arguments and presentations to justify a revision to a genus species. And in modern days, this has been a little less passionate because of genetics, but there's still, genetics alone doesn't answer everything. There's still, guys or women looking at the tiniest minutiae of the flower structure or something like that to argue that this is, a totally new species or, whatever. Anyway, some people really get into that stuff. Um, I'm a practical person. Let's think about why we look at taxonomy from a practical perspective. And ideally, what genus species or using the proper scientific name does is it avoids errors. Now, this is, like it says in the slide, most applicable to people who work at a nursery or a botanical garden. Nurseries typically grow hundreds, if not thousands, of varieties of plants. And so an employee working at a nursery needs to understand the genus species, because when they're building orders and you're going out and you're trying to do inventory or pick orders or whatever, or the head grower or the manager says, hey, we need you to go take care of the Euonymus japonicus, and you need to know where that is. And sometimes the tag isn't all that clear, which is a problem, but anyways. But on the slide, I kind of tried to find a good example of where the genus species might make a difference. And here we have a Euonymus fortunei and a Euonymus japonicus. And they essentially, the leaves look the same. I mean, my pictures are a little but they look the same, right? The leaves do, but their growing habit is very different. The Euonymus fortunei is a creeping or a low spreading ground cover type Euonymus, where the Euonymus japonicus is actually an upright shrub. I purposely chose a picture that doesn't make it obvious, but if it's a young plant and it's not very big in the pot and you just grab one and you sell it to someone and they're expecting a creeping ground cover Euonymus and suddenly they have a upright shrub, they're not going to be very happy, because that might have taken a year or two to present itself before they figured out that there was a mistake. So understanding exactly what it is you have and having the proper name means that you can communicate effectively and there's fewer errors. So types of classification. So we've talked about taxonomic. That's the genus, species, and the nuances there. We also look at things like the plant itself. What does the stem growth look like? What are the shape of the leaves? What is the life cycle? Is it an annual or is it a perennial? Similarly, what are the ages of the tissues, right? Are they, multi-years old or only a few days old? Does it drop its leaves? Like, these are just some examples we're going to get into a little more later. So when we start looking at plant classification beyond just the genus species, right, we're looking at things like, is it a perennial? Is it deciduous? Is it woody? Is it a higher vascular? We're going to talk about that next week. Is it flowering? Is it dicot? We'll talk again a bit more about that next week. And further dividing genus and species is something termed variety and cultivar. Now, this is a topic that I see a lot of confusion around. The difference between a variety and a cultivar is that a variety is naturally occurring. Okay, so it's considered a full category of species that is naturally occurring. So that means that it's growing outdoors. It's what we call open pollinated, and if you collect the seed and you plant it, what comes up very closely resembles the plant that seed came from. A cultivar, on the other hand, is maintained by human activity, typically cross-selected or just cuttings are taken. And if you were to leave it out in the open and let it open pollinate and collect the seed, it would not actually emerge the same as the plant that you collected the seed from. So it needs to be maintained by human activity. It's not self-maintaining. And a very extreme example on the slide is Queen Anne's lace, which is Daucus carota, and you can tell from the name carota that it is a carrot. And then there's the Nelson hybrid carrot on the right. So Queen Anne's lace is actually sort of one of the origins of what the carrot was. So if you dig up the root, you'll see an elongated, widened tuber that would be a starch storing structure that you could eat. I don't know that Queen Anne's lace tastes very good. I'm not going to recommend that. But what's interesting about this, and this kind of I find as an interesting topic because um, people talk about heirloom varieties and things like that in gardening, and it's an interesting discussion, and I think a lot of the times it's born out of perhaps an ignorance of where vegetables came from. Um, Let me elaborate, and of course you will there. Uh, the Victorian era, going back to our friend Carl and his cronies, uh, that whole Victorian era was a time when we suddenly had transportation around the world. Explorers had charted courses through the oceans. We had reliable boats, somewhat, and shipping routes. And so wealthy people who could afford to just get on a boat and have people bring food and feed them and drive them everywhere, they would go out into the world and they would collect plants and animals and they would bring them home and they experimented on them. And you're thinking, what are you talking about, Derek? Well, let me just say one thing: dogs. I mean, I think we all know that really dogs came from either foxes or wolves or coyotes or dingoes. Those are where dogs came from. But if you look at a pug or a lab or a German shepherd or a poodle, whatever, all these varieties that people these dogs, wrong word, that people cherish and have. Oh, I have a purebred German Shepherd. Um, they fail to acknowledge that these animals were created. They are essentially what we would call, in the Hort word, a cultivar. They were created by people who were just constantly breeding and crossing and selecting and breeding and selecting, and they created out of this genetic material totally unique species. And so the carrot you see on the right, the Nelson carrot, was created by humans messing around with the lineages of carrots that they received. And the original carrots would have been bred from wild plants that people selected from their gardens and and just started crossing for fun. Now they had the time. These were wealthy people. They didn't have to go out and feed their family before winter, where they would die. So that's how it happened that it was the wealthy people that were able to do this. But I just want to seed this thought in your minds that when someone talks about heirloom, um, what exactly are they talking about? How far removed is an heirloom from the original plant that it was from? Immensely far. It's almost like saying, okay, you've traveled a light year, and let's back up 5 kilometers, and let's call that an heirloom. Well, I mean, okay, you could, but you're really only 5 kilometers back from what it originally was. So uh, heirloom, I'm going to tell you, heirloom varieties, when people talk about heirloom varieties, they just mean old varieties. And to some extent, that there's a little bit of a misnomer about that because a lot of modern varieties have bred in resistance for things like mildew or botrytis. They have maybe increased pest resistance. Not necessarily talking about GMOs here, but they have been bred to improve. Um, and this idea that, oh, heirlooms taste so good, uh, I'm going to challenge you on that one because taste is a highly subjective thing. And a lot of times people like to use the taste argument when they compare their own garden produce versus something they buy in the grocery store. Those are totally different beasts. And yes, the stuff you grew in the garden probably did taste very good because you allowed it to fully ripen before you picked it and you ate it. And we'll talk about more about that as the program goes on. But from my perspective, there's so many compromises made in food before it gets to a grocery store because of the systems that are all dictated by how people shop. And so if people are not going to buy a bruised tomato or a bruised peach, then that means the farmer can't grow the tomato or the peach to the same level of ripeness before they ship it because it's going to end up bruised. Um, so it's a complicated argument. It's a complicated topic. Uh, and I think as you go through the program, I would hope that you keep an open mind and think through from the perspective that farmers are people too, and they're trying to make a living, and they're trying to keep their customers happy. And I think probably the best thing you could ever do is when you go grocery shopping, be honest with yourself and watch your own habits. See what you do. When you go to the produce aisle, do you naturally sift through the produce to find the nicest one? Because the second you do that, you're reinforcing the model that the farmer has to have perfect produce in order for someone to buy it, because otherwise it's going to get thrown out and then we have food waste. So I always try to flip this all around on the consumers. You know, farmers are just business people. They're just trying to make a living. And as consumers, if we are steering them in a way that forces them into practices that we're not happy with, who's at fault? Is it us or is it them? So I want you to think about that and think about it honestly, you know, and put aside prejudices and try to think through what does a farmer have to do to make a living, and what am I doing as a consumer in the decisions that I make. Um, if you Google up the French ugly food movement, you'll understand the topic a little more clearly, because there's been a real sort of awakening in France where consumers realize this relationship, and they wanted to send a clear message to the farmers that having produce that was damaged was perfectly fine, to the extent that people were willing to pay a premium for damaged produce. And the farmers are getting that message loud and clear. France may be one messed up country, but there are a lot of things they do that really impress me from a food and agricultural perspective. Um, Anyways, that's enough of a diversion. You'll get to know me. I love diversions. I also think that diversions are the spice of life that keeps school interesting. So, watch out. So varieties are naturally occurring. Okay, they are a species. Uh, they typically breed true to type. So I'm just summarizing here. So if you let them open pollinate, collect the seed, plant it again, what grows looks very similar to what you started with. And most importantly, varieties do not have breeders' rights. That means that anyone can legally grow it. No one's going to sue you for growing it in your garden. Cultivars are human-made categories where someone has purposely created the species through diverse crosses, or maybe even just taking cuttings over years, although that system doesn't really last for that long. A lot of the bedding industry is just cuttings, but you'll notice that after 3, 4, 5 years, they're producing new cultivars, because the original ones, the plants, they weaken if you just constantly take cuttings, and you need diversity. So they just keep bringing out new cultivars every 3, 4 years. Cultivars do not breed true to type. So if you took it, and so if you had a good example, let's say you had a petunia in your hanging basket this summer, depending on where your petunia was growing, you may have noticed that some of the seeds that fell from your petunia actually regrew, and they will come up with different petal colors, typically more washed out. So they're not breeding true to type. It's still a petunia, but it's not quite the same. And typically cultivars have what we call breeders' rights associated. That means that there's a legal contract associated with growing it, and in order to grow it, you pay a small fee or a royalty to the breeder. Otherwise, they can sue you. And in recent years, they have been going after farmers who thought they would save some money by, illegally reproducing plants. I'll give you an example. We used to grow a lot of mandevilla in our greenhouse. And mandevillas, there are some mandevilla varieties that are out there. They're hard to get because most of the ones that are in the market are cultivars. And if you have a cultivar and you start taking your own cuttings and propagating it, the company will go around to garden centers and they'll take samples and they'll send them off to a lab and they'll do a genetic sequence. And it comes back as a copy of their cultivar and there's no registered tag with it, then you get sued. And a few farmers have been sued in the Niagara region over the last few years, so it does happen. And I say tag because when you pay a royalty, they ship you tags, and the tags are specific from that company. If you see generic tags, then you have not paid your royalty. So the cultivar topic is intense. Here's sort of a classic example of a variety and a cultivar, although I'm going to get into this, not exactly the same. But anyways, on the left is a wild geranium. These grow in Ontario. You see them on the Bruce Trail everywhere. So on the left is a wild geranium. On the right is a cultivar geranium. Now, specifically, these are actually different genus species. I wanted to highlight that because all geraniums are not in the same genus species. So on the left is Geranium maculatum, And the common name is cranesbills, and primarily because once the flowers are done, the seeds look like a cranesbill, like a little bump with a long sort of beak. Where on the right is Pelargonium zonale, which is a cultivar, and it's known as Americana light pink splash. Um, Now, going back to the Geranium maculatum, which is the wild variety of geranium that we see in Ontario, there are actually cultivar versions of that where they've made selections for, in this case, white double flowers. And this is, in fact, the Geranium pratense cultivar Laura. It's much more closely related to the Geranium maculatum. Another example of cultivars versus variety, and also looking at the sort of getting into the nerdy um, sort of taxonomic structure of how you write it. A redbud tree, redbuds are typically in the bottom corner, you see what a redbud normally looks like, a pinkish, reddish flower. And there is a redbud variety that has white flowers, and it's known as Circus canadensis variety alba, or Circus, whatever. Alba is Latin for white, which means, okay, so it's the same genus species as redbud, but it is a variety with a white flower. So you could just go genus species, but then you have to add the variety if you're going to specify the flower color. But then there's also a cultivar version of a redbud that was selected and maintained by horticulturalists that is known as Circus canadensis lavender twist, right? And the lavender twist is actually a hanging, weeping redbud. Red pink flowers, but the branches, instead of being upright and horizontal, they are drooping and sort of crisscross. So that's the lavender twist. So now if you look at how it's written, with the Circus canadensis alba, there is a VAR, which is short for variety. That is not italicized. That's an important thing there. With cultivars, you have two choices, depending on who's writing it or whatever. You can just write the genus species, and then you put a single quotation marks around a non-italicized name. That indicates it's a cultivar. Or what some people do is they write CV dot and then the name lavender twist. Again, not italicized. Now, CV stands for cultivated variety, which talk about further confusion. For the longest time, I thought CV was short for cultivar, but it actually is short for cultivated variety. Anyways, if you're in the camp of, loving taxonomy, then you get right into this kind of stuff. So to summarize, lucky for you, shorter lesson today. All organisms are essentially made of two-part names, right? So we call that a binomial. So bi meaning two, nomial name of genus and species. And we typically group them by both morphological similarities into the genus. And so in a sense, it's like we put them together based on similarities for a genus, and then within the genus, we separate them by their differences into species. So we're going to talk more about this next week and dive into plants and how we do distinguish them a little more carefully. Anyways, I encourage you to talk to us if you have any questions at any time during the term. I don't have specific office hours, but happy to meet anyone in the cafeteria and help them with any material of any kind. My email is dschultz@niagaracollege.ca. You can find that on Blackboard, or even if you just go into your Outlook browser, start typing my name, it'll pop up. I can write it. I actually have a pen. Let me find it. See how this works. I'm just terrible at writing on the screen.